This week's portion is Parshat Shoftim, which means judges. I want to focus on the first three verses of the portion in order to discuss the Torah commandment to establish systems of justice. Before we get to the verses, according to Jewish tradition, all of the 613 commandments, there are 7 that are considered universal commandments that apply not just to Jews, but to all humans. The obligation to establish courts of law, a system of justice, is one of those 7 commandments. All the other 6, including murder, theft, and cursing God, are negative commandments, actions so horrible that every human is forbidden from performing them. The only positive commandment among the 7 is courts of law, which means that the one and only action that is considered by Jewish tradition to be a fundamental universal human requirement, incumbent on every person, whether Jewish or not, is establishing a system of justice. With that importance in mind, let us turn to the opening verses of our Torah portion. I want to do a traditional style, close reading of these verses, paying attention to and deriving meaning from particularities of language. Deuteronomy 16:18 reads, Shoftim v'shotrim, judges and official, titein lecha, appoint for yourselves, bechol sha'arecha, in all your gates, asher Hashem Elokecha notein lecha, which Hashem your God gives you for your tribes. V'sha'aftu et ha'am mishpat tzedek, they shall judge the people with righteous justice. The first thing that I would like to notice is that the commandment here, spoken by Moshe to the entire people, is, you shall appoint for yourselves. The power of the government and the judiciary comes from the people. They have authority over us, but we, the people, give them that authority. Next, note that we are to appoint 2 different types of people, judges and officials. Most commentators interpret this as a specialization or a separation of powers between a judicial branch and an executive branch. Judges decide what is the right way to carry out the law in any particular instance, and officials to enforce the judge's decision on anyone who does not otherwise comply. Next, why does the verse specify in all your gates and for your tribes? Gates means to appoint the judges and officials for each city. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, 12th century Spanish commentator, makes a connection to the immediately preceding passage of Deuteronomy about the thrice yearly pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He says that if 3 times a year everyone travels to the center of priestly leadership, and you can have your questions answered, your crimes tried, and your disputes resolved there, you might think that that centralized infrastructure should be sufficient. These verses come immediately to tell us, no, the judicial infrastructure is not adequate unless you have judges in every single city, in every region of the land. Justice is designed to be pervasive and embedded throughout every society that has the foresight to ground themselves in fairness and political equanimity. This teaching strikes me as holding an important insight for us today. We can have a tendency to see justice as exclusively the responsibility of the government. The federal and state governments establish the laws and enforce them. Our role is only to obey them, call in the agents of the state when we know about a law being disobeyed, and vote for our representatives in the government. If we are inspired to be more actively involved in justice, it's often still through the government, lobbying branches of the government, activism directed at changing government policy, even running for office ourselves. But wait, the very verses teaching us that we need an authoritative judicial structure are also teaching us that this one central government is not enough. The responsibility to establish systems of justice cannot be outsourced to the government of the land to be called in to enforce morality. Rather, we must, in each of our communities and relationships, build our own structures for keeping ourselves honest and settling our disputes. We could use today a more dispersed, diverse sense of what justice is and what each of our responsibilities are in ensuring fairness and equality and equity. The final clause of the verse, they shall judge the people with righteous justice, turns to the appointed judges and officials and reminds us of a deeply important lesson. The righteousness of the judges should not be taken for granted. We have 2 different words in the Hebrew, mishpat and tzedek, justice and righteousness. The justice system you establish must be a righteous one, but this statement is prescriptive, not descriptive. We know very well how often systems of courts and criminal justice can be sources instead of injustice and cruelty. This verse charges us with ensuring that the systems of justice we give authority to truly are righteous. The next verse, Deuteronomy 17:19, reads, Lo tateh mishpat, do not turn aside or pervert justice. Lo takir panim, literally, do not know faces, which might mean do not show favoritism. V'lo tikash shochad, do not take a bribe. Shochad yaver enei chachamim v'salef divrei tzadikim. For a bribe will blind the eyes of the wise and twist the words of the righteous. A big question about this verse is, who is it talking to? On the one hand, it sounds like it's describing important bounds on how a judge in particular should behave, perhaps an expansion and clarification of the end of the previous verse that said, they shall judge the people with righteous justice. On the other hand, the you that Moshe was addressing in the last verse was the whole people, and he referred to the future judges as they. The classical commentators recognize this inconsistency, and some propose that it's not only warnings to the judges not to take bribes or show favoritism towards disputants, but rather, or additionally, a warning to the people not to show favoritism in their selection of the judges. I want to suggest that the ambiguity of this verse is its own deep message. The people and the judges are blurred here because they are in fact not so separable. We are all a part of the justice system as disputants, as mediators, as judges, as appointees of the judges. We all have a responsibility to ensure that the system does not become corrupt, because while systems of authority are necessary for the functioning of society, they also all have great potential to do harm. Finally, the third verse of the portion includes one of the most well-known phrases of the entire Torah, tzedek tzedek tirdof, justice, justice, or as we have been translating it, righteousness, righteousness, you shall pursue. Lama'an tihiyeh v'yarashta et ha'aretz asher Hashem Elokecha noten lach, in order that you may live and you shall inherit the land that Hashem your God gives you. Tzedek tzedek tirdof has served as a rallying cry for so much Jewish social justice work. In this context, speaking about our relationship to judicial systems, I believe these words can help us to amend what we said at the beginning of this discussion. I said that a fundamental universal requirement of all humanity is to establish systems of justice. But the word used here does not mean to establish or even to create. Tirdof, pursue, chase after, has a very different meaning. We cannot create or inherit a justice system and then brush off our hands and walk away, as if our responsibility to this vital commandment has been fulfilled. Justice, righteousness, is a dynamic ideal, an eternal, personal, and communal, positive commandment, which we must be constantly in pursuit of, constantly engaged in, constantly chasing after, each and every one of us. Shabbat Shalom.